So, in the past, I've received a bit of a reputation of being kind of a mad scientist kind of character, and once I even made the news for it.
Remind you of anything?
It's alive! It's alive!
But this inventor is no Dr. Frankenstein.
And to continue with that trend, in this video, I'm going to take a RC car that we got on Boxing Day, and this is a fairly cheap RC car, it came with a tiny little motor, and I'm going to combine it with a drill to make this drifting torque machine you see right here. So this thing's a beast. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and please feel free to like and subscribe if you want to see more. So we got 3 cars on Boxing Day, 2 for the kids to play with, and 1 for me to void the warranty on. Now, the easy way to increase the power output is simply to increase the voltage. So I decided to upgrade from the 4 AA batteries and install a 12-volt drill battery instead. My first step will be to locate the 2 motor wire pins that come off from the original controller and find a way to use them as input signals for the higher voltage circuit. So the original controller that comes with this car is really only designed for a very specific voltage range, likely around 4 to 7 volts, and will probably not survive an increase in voltage. The motor, on the other hand, I would expect to get hot, but it should be able to handle short bursts at 12 volts. I decided to go with the 298N and H-bridge motor controller, and it's got a built-in 5-volt output that I can use for the original controller that came with the car. So this little controller also allows me to connect the original motor control wires and use them as input wires to turn on the new 12-volt power supply to the motor. So this essentially allows me to leave most of the original control circuit alone, and the only modifications I need to make is the output circuit and making space for the battery. So a little duct tape and a little reassembly, we are ready for a test drive. So I was pretty happy with the result. It definitely had better performance in a side-by-side comparison with my son's RC car, which is pretty much the same, but just not modified. But I felt like I could do better. So I decided to shove in a bigger battery and see what happens. So while looking into the ratings for the L298N, I found that it was actually rated for up to 35 volts, and it could still maintain 5 volts on that output pin to the controller. I decided to put in the bigger battery on the bottom of the car in an attempt to keep the center of gravity as low to the ground as possible for stability, while also making it level with the rear axle to try to maintain some sort of ground clearance. So I cut out the underbody with an old soldering iron and I mounted a drill battery dock. I 3D printed for easy removal and installation of the battery onto the bottom of the car, and I wired it all together. And this worked great. This thing took off like Bitcoin. But much like Bitcoin, it couldn't handle the demand and eventually the motor burned out. But I wasn't about to give up, and I decided to grab this big DC motor I had in my pile of things, and I was pleasantly surprised when the gear fit perfectly into the gearbox from the car. So I had to do a bit of fabricating on the case to accommodate the new motor, and I went to test it. This thing had scary torque. I could barely hold on to it. So I tossed the motor drive assembly into the car, and I gave it another try, only to have the gears start to strip and a broken axle. So, to solve this problem, I decided I needed to start from scratch with the motor and axle design. So I built the axle shaft out of some threaded rod with bearings from fidget spinners, and I 3D printed mounting bracket and a couple cogs for a small timing belt I had in my pile. I threw it all together, and I ran into 2 more issues. The first was the wheel fell off. Which I was able to fix with some Loctite. But the second issue required a little bit of a redesign for the motor because it was constantly smoking, because it was running at a very low RPM, and that causes too much current to be drawn from the motor, because motors generally are happy when they run at their optimal RPM, and this thing was nowhere near that. So I went back to my pile and I found an old drill. And I can salvage the motor and gear assembly out of this. And it was an easy solution as gearbox on most drills have a 30-to-1 gear ratio, meaning that the motor needs to rotate 30 times to make the wheels spin once. This allows for a much higher torque, and it allows the motor to rotate at a higher RPM, resolving the current draw issue. And I think while this drill was in my pile, some oil might have spilled on it at one point because it smoked for the first few minutes of use, but wow, did it have power. I couldn't keep the front wheels on the ground. I even ended up needing to move the battery pack to the front of the car just to help keep the front wheels down on the ground. And side by side, you can see the difference of power this thing had over the stock unit. But I ran into another problem pretty quick, and that's that now the suspension isn't strong enough to handle the amount of force that gets transferred up from the wheels, and I broke one of the control arms. So I'm fairly confident I'm actually going to need to redesign the whole suspension system on this thing, which probably isn't a bad idea at this point, just to be able to make it so it can do a lot more, because I would love to take this thing over a few jumps soon. I mean, with the amount of power I've increased this thing to, it's kind of a no-brainer that I could just do more hacking on it just to keep optimizing the amount of torque I can actually get out of that drill assembly. So, I mean, I wasn't going for beautiful, I was going for epically functional, and I think I've achieved that so far with this. But this will definitely be a part 1 video, and keep your eyes out for the part 2 where I will do more modifications to it. I know I can improve the gear ratio on the rear. I have a 3-to-1 ratio with these cogs that was originally there for the other motor that was on there the first try. But with this current setup, I could probably do a 1-to-1 ratio here, giving me much more top speed. Additionally, I'd also love to install some lights, maybe use some shock lights on this thing, so whenever it hits bumps, does jumps, whatever, it's just because these cool like kind of things, pulses or whatever. I'd be so epic. So let me know if you have any other ideas on what I should do to this thing, suspension wise, motor wise, power wise, increase the voltage or whatever, and see what we can do with it, because I'm having a blast so far with this little car. A lot of it's been just trial and error. As stuff breaks, I upgrade it. As stuff burns out, it really doesn't matter. My pile's nice and big, and I got lots of stuff in there. So yeah. So thanks for watching. Please feel free to like, subscribe, leave comments on what you want to see me do to this thing next, and hope you guys have a good New Year, because as of today it is New Year's Eve. So whew. Smoke.